This is the Praktica Super TL1000. It dates from around about 1985. Praktica made, well, dozens and dozens of cameras. And for my money, this is possibly the most disappointing camera that they ever made. I'm going to start my disappointment with a comparison with another Praktica camera. Let's take the lens off because it's going to make my life a bit easier. Here's one of my other cameras, which is the Praktica PL Nova 1. As you can see, there are fairly clear family familiarities between these two cameras, noticeably the shutter button on the front. If I turn them up this way, I actually think this one is a much nicer design than this one. Now, this was made in 1967 and this was made in 1985, so you'd imagine there would be a few differences. So let's look at them one by one. The first thing I'm going to do is open up the backs to see what changes have been made. On the TL1000, the back release goes like that. It's quite stiff, but it's an old camera. On the Nova, there's a switch on the side which you pull down, and the back opens in the opposite direction. A similarity is the Pentagon loading system which was developed for this camera. A clear difference is the shutter runs horizontally and on this one and is a cloth shutter, whereas on the later camera we have a vertically travelling metal plane shutter. Close up, close up. Now, with 20 years or so between the two designs, you'd expect some sort of differences, but my disappointment in this camera comes from the fact that 3 years after this was produced, Praktica produced a camera called the Praktica LTL, and the Praktica LTL had all the features of this camera. It was almost identical to this camera, except that it had a self-timer and this one doesn't. So between 1970 and 1984-1985, Praktica designs for this particular model or this particular type of camera did not change at all. And had I been buying a Praktica in 1985, I would have been truly disappointed with this. That said, let's have a little walk around the camera. The top plate is very simple. We have a hot shoe, we have our shutter speed dial, we have our adjustable ASA dial in here, which you change by lifting the collar on the shutter speed dial and rotating it, and we have a pretty standard rewind crank. To rewind the film on this one, I have to depress the button in the bottom first, which releases the clutch in here. A very meaty clunk to this camera. Let's see what it sounds like at 1000th. Not a quiet machine. The meter is a stop down through the lens meter, which means that you operate the meter with this switch here, which looks like it's being eaten by rats. As I depress this lever, the lens should shut down, and at this point I can take the meter reading. Obviously there's a lot less light here, but it does double up as a depth of field preview. Frame counter on the top, battery cover on the bottom, as well as the tripod mount. The battery in this one is a curiously labelled 1.3 volt battery, which is no longer available. 1.5 volt batteries kind of work in it, but you have to make some adjustments. So, wind the camera on, take the meter reading, fire the shutter. It doesn't get any simpler than that, and again that generally adds to my disappointment, because this camera was made in an age where electronic cameras were very common, they were very sophisticated, and this camera is neither of those things. However, as I always say, these cameras were cheap and cheerful, they got people involved in photography, and therefore they've got to be a good thing. As good as a Minolta XD7? Well, I don't think so. As good as an Nikon FM2? Possibly not. But they weren't made for that market. Primarily their function was to get currency for the regime in Eastern Europe, and they did that very, very well. They sold tens of thousands of Prakticas over the period, and as a consequence perhaps a few thousand of those people will become passionate about photography.